Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. The person who talks the most in the room is not the most powerful, they are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks only once, and that single truth alone is enough to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built until today. 95% of people negotiate in a way that makes the other party win automatically, not because they are weak, but because they do not realize they started losing before they ever open their mouths. And what is more dangerous than the loss itself is the false sense of security that accompanies it. If you need other people's approval to validate your decisions, you have not built an identity yet. You have built a dependency. The person you think is confident in your circle most likely does not possess confidence at all. They possess trained indifference, engineered with precision and deliberate practice. The difference between the two does not reveal itself in ordinary moments. It reveals itself the instant pressure is applied, and everything collapses within seconds. There is one sentence, if spoken at the beginning of any negotiation, that makes the other party feel they are in control, while you are the one orchestrating everything from behind an invisible curtain. This sentence is not magic, it's linguistic engineering built on a deep understanding of how the brain functions under the pressure of decision. And the book you are about to hear today is not taught in MBA programs for one reason only, because it explains how the game works from the inside, in a language never designed for the general public. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. This is for those who have made a final, irreversible decision to understand how social dominance is built scientifically and systematically, far beyond empty slogans and packaged advice. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction whatsoever, close this video. But if you feel there is another level you have not yet reached, a level seen by few and lived by even fewer, continue, because what follows was engineered for you alone. Every single day you pass without understanding these rules, someone else is understanding them and applying them to you in complete silence. This is not theoretical assumption, and it is not rhetorical exaggeration. This is what is happening right now in every boardroom, at every negotiation table, and in every relationship where one party believes the dynamic is equal. The money you didn't earn this month didn't vanish into thin air. It went to someone who knows one rule you do not know yet, and it will keep going to them for as long as this cognitive gap remains open. There is a belief so thoroughly embedded in the cultural mythology surrounding personal influence and social power that questioning it feels almost like questioning gravity. The belief that charisma is a natural endowment, a genetic lottery prize distributed at birth to the fortunate few who will spend their lives effortlessly commanding rooms, generating instant trust, and producing in everyone they encounter the specific quality of fascinated attention that the majority of professionals spend entire careers attempting to manufacture through credentials, titles, and the accumulation of accomplishments that never quite produce the social gravitational force they were supposed to generate. This belief is not merely incorrect, it is the single most expensive misconception in the entire domain of professional development. Expensive because it convinces the professional who holds it that the most consequential dimension of their social and professional effectiveness is fixed, unchallengeable, and beyond the reach of the deliberate development that every other professional skill responds to. And the professionals who operate under this misconception spend their careers building expertise, accumulating knowledge, and developing technical capabilities of genuine excellence, while leaving the dimension of their professional impact that most directly determines how that expertise, knowledge, and capability is received, valued, and acted upon by every person they encounter entirely to the genetic accident of their birth. The scientific literature on charisma and social influence has been accumulating with sufficient rigor and sufficient consistency for long enough that its central finding is no longer a matter of serious academic controversy. Charisma is not a trait, it is a set of behaviors.
Specifically, it is a constellation of precisely identifiable, precisely learnable, and precisely practicable behavioral patterns that produce specific and measurable effects in the neurological and psychological processing of the people who observe them, effects that manifest as the experience of being drawn toward, fascinated by, and inclined to trust and follow the person exhibiting those patterns. These behavioral patterns are not mysterious. They are not the exclusive province of the naturally gifted. They are engineering specifications, technical descriptions of the precise inputs that produce the desired social outputs. And like every engineering specification, they can be studied, understood, internalized, and executed with a precision that transforms their outputs from accidental to intentional, from occasional to consistent, and from the property of the few who stumbled into them naturally to the capability of anyone who engages with their development with the seriousness and the systematic discipline that genuine professional skill development requires.
The framework that this book presents is built on a foundational distinction that the charisma mythology consistently obscures: the distinction between charisma as a state and charisma as a trait. Charisma as a state is the scientific reality, a specific configuration of psychological, physiological, and behavioral conditions that produces charismatic effects when present and fails to produce them when absent, and that can be deliberately cultivated, reliably entered, and consistently maintained through the development of the specific skills and practices that the framework details. The professional who understands charisma as a state rather than a trait does not ask whether they have charisma. They ask whether they have developed the capability to reliably enter the charismatic state in the professional contexts where its effects are most consequential. And if not, what specific developmental work would build that capability? The charismatic state is constituted by three simultaneous conditions whose co-presence produces the social gravitational force that observers experience as charisma. The first condition is presence, the complete, undivided, genuinely absorbed engagement with the current moment and the person or people within it, communicated through every channel of the professional's behavioral output simultaneously. The second condition is power, the communication through the same behavioral channels of a genuine sense of capability, confidence, and the specific quality of self-possessed ease that signals to every social observer that this person does not need the approval of the room to be complete, capable, and entirely at home in their own authority. The third condition is warmth, the genuine, behaviorally expressed orientation toward the other person's experience, interests, and significance that creates the feeling of being seen, valued, and genuinely engaged with, rather than merely tolerated or managed. The simultaneous communication of all three conditions through every available behavioral channel, posture, movement, vocal quality, facial expression, eye contact, linguistic architecture, and the management of time and silence is the operational definition of charismatic behavior, and each of its components is a learnable, practicable, developable skill. The engineering framework through which this book develops these skills is built on the recognition that charismatic behavior is not a performance layered on top of the professional's authentic self. It is the authentic self's most fully expressed, most behaviorally precise, most socially calibrated manifestation. The professional who develops genuine charismatic capability is not learning to pretend to be someone they are not. They are learning to remove the behavioral static, the habits of self-diminishment, social anxiety, approval-seeking, and presence-compromising distraction that prevents their authentic capabilities, values, and genuine engagement with others from being communicated through the behavioral channels that social perception depends on. Every professional who has ever felt more capable than they appeared, more engaged than they communicated, and more valuable than others seemed to recognize is a professional whose behavioral engineering has failed to transmit what their internal reality actually contains. And the gap between that internal reality and its behavioral transmission is precisely the gap that this framework is designed to close. There is a 3-second window at the beginning of every significant professional encounter that determines more of the social outcome than everything that follows combined. A window so brief that it falls entirely below the threshold of conscious deliberation for both parties, operating instead through the automatic, instantaneous, precognitive social assessment machinery that the human brain has been running continuously and with extraordinary speed and accuracy for the entirety of human social evolution. In this window, every person you encounter makes a comprehensive set of judgments about your status, your capability, your confidence, your trustworthiness, and your social dominance that will function as the interpretive framework through which every subsequent piece of information you provide, every argument you make, every credential you cite, every demonstration of competence you offer will be filtered, weighted, and evaluated. These judgments are not conscious conclusions reached through deliberate analytical reasoning. They are automatic perceptual outputs of a social assessment system that operates with the speed and the authority of direct sensory perception, delivering its verdicts with the same immediate, pre-reflective certainty as the perception of color or the experience of temperature. And they are determined almost entirely by the behavioral signals you are transmitting in that 3 seconds, signals whose content you have the capability to engineer with precision once you understand the specific inputs that the social assessment system is processing and the specific outputs those inputs produce. The social assessment system that operates in those 3 seconds is not evaluating your words you have not yet spoken. It is evaluating a comprehensive array of nonverbal signals transmitted simultaneously through multiple behavioral channels, whose integrated output produces an immediate, holistic impression of your social position, psychological state, and interpersonal orientation. The primary channels through which these signals are transmitted are postural configuration, movement quality, spatial behavior, facial baseline expression, and the specific quality of attentional orientation that your body communicates about where your awareness is directed and what it is engaged with. Each of these channels is transmitting continuously and simultaneously, and the social assessment system integrates the information from all channels into a single, immediate, high-confidence verdict about who you are in the social hierarchy of the space you have just entered. Postural configuration is the most immediately legible of these channels because it communicates the body's relationship to gravity in ways that the social brain has been reading as status signals with extraordinary reliability across the full span of human social evolution. The body that occupies vertical space fully, that extends upward with the spine's natural length, rather than compressing it through the forward rounding that anxiety and self-diminishment produce, communicates a relationship to gravity that the social brain reads automatically and immediately as the postural signature of high status and genuine confidence. The body that occupies horizontal space deliberately, that allows the shoulders to remain at their natural width rather than drawing them inward in the protective contraction that social anxiety generates, communicates the same signal through a different spatial dimension. And the body that is still, that does not generate the small, unconscious, self-soothing movements of weight shifting, clothing adjustment, and object manipulation that nervous system activation produces, communicates through its stillness a quality of self-contained ease that the social brain reads as the behavioral signature of a person who does not need the approval of the room to feel secure within it. Movement quality is the second primary channel of the sovereign presence signal, and its importance derives from a specific feature of human social perception, the automatic reading of movement speed as a proxy for social urgency, which is itself a proxy for social status. The person who moves quickly through social space is communicating, through the speed of their movement, a relationship to time that the social brain reads as the movement signature of someone who is accommodating the demands of their environment, rather than operating within it from a position of authority. The person who moves with deliberate, unhurried quality, not the exaggerated slowness of performed composure, but the natural, unconstricted movement of someone whose internal sense of time is not being compressed by social anxiety or approval-seeking urgency, communicates the movement signature of someone whose relationship to the social environment is one of genuine ease rather than effortful management. Spatial behavior is the third channel, and its most consequential dimension is the professional's relationship to the physical space they occupy upon entering a new social environment. The socially anxious professional enters a space and immediately contracts into the smallest footprint that social convention will permit, finding the wall, the corner, the position that minimizes their social exposure, and the corresponding risk of the negative social evaluation that exposure makes possible. The Sovereign Presence Protocol reverses this spatial behavior completely. It enters a space and expands into it deliberately, claiming the spatial territory that the social environment makes available with the same natural ease that genuine social confidence produces in the people who possess it without having had to develop it consciously. This spatial expansion is not aggression, and it is not performance. It is the behavioral transmission of the specific relationship to social space that the social brain reads as the environmental signature of high status and genuine confidence. The facial baseline expression is the fourth channel, and its most critical dimension is what researchers in the psychology of first impressions have identified as the approachability dominance balance, the specific configuration of facial muscle activation that communicates simultaneously the warmth that makes the observer feel that engagement with this person would be rewarding, and the confidence that makes the observer feel that this person's engagement with them is worth having. The approachability dominance balance is not a fixed facial expression. It is a dynamic quality of facial responsiveness that communicates genuine interest in the social environment without the eager-to-please quality that excessive approachability produces, and genuine confidence without the closed-off quality that excessive dominance produces. Its cultivation requires the development of what might be called facial sovereignty, the capacity to maintain a baseline expression of calm, interested, self-possessed engagement with the social environment that does not require the external stimulus of positive social feedback to sustain itself. The attentional orientation that the body communicates is the fifth and perhaps most consequential channel of the sovereign presence signal, because it communicates more directly than any other behavioral channel the quality of the professional's engagement with the social environment they have just entered. The professional whose attentional orientation is fragmented, whose eyes move quickly from point to point, whose body orients and reorients repeatedly, whose overall behavioral signature communicates a mind that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, is transmitting an attentional signal that the social brain reads as the signature of anxiety, social insecurity, and the compulsive environmental monitoring that genuine confidence makes unnecessary. The professional whose attentional orientation is focused, deliberate, and genuinely absorbed, who enters a space and brings their full attention to bear on specific elements of it with the unhurried quality of someone who has all the time they need, is transmitting the attentional signal that the social brain reads as the signature of the person who is most fully present, most genuinely engaged, and most worthy of the corresponding attention of everyone in the space they have entered. There is a behavioral sequence that the highest performing social actors in every professional domain have developed through years of trial, observation, and refinement that transforms the act of entering a professional environment from the anxiety-laden, self-conscious, approval-seeking experience that the majority of professionals navigate with varying degrees of discomfort into a precisely engineered social intervention whose effects on the room's collective perception of the entering professional are as deliberate, as controlled, and as predictable as any other precision engineering output. This sequence is not a performance in the theatrical sense. It does not require the suspension of authenticity or the adoption of a social mask that the professional must maintain through effortful vigilance. It is a behavioral protocol whose consistent practice produces the gradual internalization of the specific physical and psychological states that charismatic first impressions require, transforming what begins as conscious, deliberate behavioral execution into the automatic, natural expression of a sovereign presence that has been genuinely developed rather than merely performed. The engineering of a first impression is not the engineering of a deception. It is the engineering of an accurate transmission of the professional's actual capabilities, values, and genuine social worth through the behavioral channels that social perception depends on, channels that most professionals have never learned to use with the precision that their actual qualities deserve. The first impression engineering protocol begins before the professional enters the physical space of the social encounter. It begins in the 30 seconds immediately preceding entry, in the preparation phase that most professionals spend either in anxious anticipation of the social evaluation they're about to face, or in the distracted management of logistical details whose completion they have delayed until the last possible moment. Both of these pre-entry states produce the same consequence. They bring the professional into the social encounter in a psychological and physiological state that is the direct opposite of the sovereign presence that the first 3 seconds require. The anxiously anticipating professional enters in a state of elevated nervous system activation, whose physiological signatures, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, increased muscle tension, heightened cortisol, are transmitted through every nonverbal channel simultaneously, producing the exact behavioral signature of social anxiety that the sovereign presence protocol is designed to replace. The logistics managing professional enters in a state of fragmented attention, whose behavioral signature communicates the same absence of genuine social presence as anxiety through the different mechanism of cognitive preoccupation rather than emotional activation. The 30-second preparation protocol addresses both of these pre-entry states through a specific sequence of physiological and psychological interventions that reliably shift the professional's internal state toward the psychological and physiological conditions that sovereign presence requires. The first intervention is the physiological reset, a specific breathing pattern whose execution produces measurable reductions in cortisol, reductions in heart rate variability, and increases in the parasympathetic nervous system activation that the body's sovereign presence behavioral signatures require as their physiological foundation. The pattern consists of a 4-count inhalation through the nose, a brief hold, and a longer 8-count exhalation through the mouth, a ratio that activates the vagal brake with sufficient reliability to produce the physiological state of calm, alert engagement that the sovereign presence behavioral protocol requires in the time available between the decision to enter and the actual moment of entry. The second pre-entry intervention is the psychological sovereignty activation, a specific internal orientation practice that shifts the professional's attentional focus from the approval-seeking, evaluation-anticipating orientation that social anxiety produces to the genuine curiosity orientation that authentic, charismatic presence communicates. The practice is deceptively simple in its formulation, the deliberate direction of genuine curiosity toward the specific human beings in the environment about to be entered, replacing the question of how will they evaluate me with the question of what is genuinely interesting about the people I am about to encounter. This reorientation is not merely a cognitive trick, it produces a genuine shift in the professional's behavioral output across every nonverbal channel simultaneously. Because genuine curiosity about other people produces the specific facial responsiveness, attentional orientation, and interpersonal warmth that charismatic presence requires, while self-focused evaluation anxiety produces the behavioral signatures of social insecurity that undermine it.
The entry itself is governed by the sovereign pace protocol, the deliberate management of movement speed, spatial behavior, and attentional orientation during the first 5 seconds of physical presence in the new social environment. The sovereign pace is not slow, it is unhurried, which is a categorically different quality. Slowness is the absence of speed. Unhurriedness is the presence of ease, the behavioral quality of someone whose relationship to time is not being compressed by social urgency, whose movement through space communicates genuine comfort with the pace they have chosen, and whose attentional orientation demonstrates the selective, deliberate quality of someone who is choosing what to engage with, rather than reactively scanning for threats and approval signals. The sovereign pace enters, pauses, a brief but deliberate moment of stillness that communicates the ease of someone who does not need to immediately orient themselves because their relationship to the social environment is one of authority rather than adaptation, and then moves with the unhurried quality of genuine social confidence toward the first point of engagement.
The first point of engagement is not determined by the anxious professional's default logic, which is to find the least socially exposed position, the most familiar face, or the most immediately available conversational partner. It is determined by the sovereign presence logic, which selects the first engagement point based on the social dynamics of the room rather than on the professional's comfort preferences, moving toward the highest status person in the immediate environment, the most socially central position in the space, or the most strategically significant conversational opportunity available. This selection communicates, through the behavioral signal of the professional's movement direction, a relationship to the social hierarchy of the room that is one of natural equality with its highest levels, rather than deference to them. And this signal is registered by every observer in the environment simultaneously, adjusting their social assessment of the entering professional upward in correspondence with the confidence that the movement direction implies. The greeting protocol that initiates the first engagement completes the first impression engineering sequence through the precise management of the three behavioral dimensions that initial interpersonal contact transmits most powerfully: eye contact initiation, physical contact quality where culturally appropriate, and the vocal and linguistic architecture of the opening exchange. Each of these dimensions has a specific sovereign presence specification, whose execution produces the immediate interpersonal impression of a professional whose social confidence is genuine, whose engagement is complete, and whose presence in the room constitutes a social event rather than a social addition. There is a single nonverbal behavior whose mastery produces more immediate, more measurable, and more consistently documented effects on the social perception of status, confidence, and authority than any other element of the charismatic behavioral repertoire. A behavior so fundamental to the social brain's processing of interpersonal dynamics that its precise execution can transform the entire power configuration of a professional encounter within seconds of its deployment, and whose absence or mismanagement communicates the specific behavioral signatures of social anxiety and approval seeking that undermine charismatic presence more rapidly and more completely than any other nonverbal failure mode. This behavior is eye contact, and the gap between its ordinary deployment, in which most professionals use it as a reflexive social habit whose parameters are determined by comfort and convention rather than by strategic intention, and its sovereign deployment, in which the charismatic professional uses it as a precision instrument of social influence whose every parameter is consciously calibrated to produce specific effects in the social processing of every person it engages, is one of the most consequential developmental gaps in the charismatic skill repertoire. The social brain's processing of eye contact is among the most extensively studied phenomena in the psychology of interpersonal perception, and the consistency of the research findings across cultures, contexts, and professional domains is extraordinary.
Eye contact duration, initiation timing, breaking pattern, and intensity each communicate specific and distinct information to the observer's social assessment system. Information about the gazer's confidence level, their social status relative to the observer, their degree of genuine interest in the observer, and their psychological relationship to the social evaluation that the interaction involves. These communications are not interpreted consciously by the observer. They are processed automatically by the social assessment system that the previous sections have established as the primary arbiter of first impressions and ongoing social verdicts. And they produce their effects on the observer's perception of the gazer before any conscious evaluation of those effects has occurred. The most fundamental dimension of eye contact as a power tool is what researchers in social dominance behavior have identified as the gaze dominance ratio, the relationship between the amount of time a person maintains eye contact while speaking versus while listening, and what that ratio communicates about their social confidence and status orientation. The socially anxious professional maintains significantly more eye contact while listening than while speaking, a pattern that communicates, through the specific signals of attentional deference that this ratio produces, a social orientation of seeking approval from the person being listened to and anxiety about the social evaluation that speaking exposes them to. The socially confident professional maintains the inverse ratio, more eye contact while speaking than while listening, a pattern that communicates the specific signals of social confidence and status ease that characterize the behavioral repertoire of people whose relationship to social evaluation is one of genuine indifference rather than anxious monitoring. The Sovereign Presence Protocol calibrates the gaze dominance ratio deliberately, shifting it toward the confidence signaling pattern through the consistent practice of maintaining eye contact through the full completion of one's own statements, rather than breaking it at the moments of social vulnerability, the moments of making a claim, expressing an opinion, or asserting a position that anxiety habitually selects as its breaking points. The second dimension is eye contact initiation. Who establishes the gaze connection first in any interpersonal encounter, and what the initiation timing communicates about the initiator's social orientation. Encounter and waits for the other party to establish eye contact before reciprocating is communicating through the passivity of their gaze initiation a social orientation of response rather than agency, a behavioral signal that the social assessment system reads as the gaze signature of someone who was adapting to the social environment rather than shaping it. The Sovereign Presence Protocol initiates eye contact, deliberately, calmly, and with the specific quality of genuine interest rather than aggressive challenge, at the first available moment of the encounter, establishing from the interaction's initial seconds the gaze dynamic of someone whose relationship to the social encounter is one of active engagement rather than passive response. The third dimension is the breaking pattern, how, when, and in which direction eye contact is broken, and what each breaking configuration communicates about the breaker's social confidence and status. The most consequential breaking pattern distinction is between breaking eye contact by looking downward versus breaking it by looking to the side. Looking downward when breaking eye contact is the universal behavioral signature of social submission. It communicates, through the specific postural and gaze dynamics of the downward break, a relationship to the social encounter that the social brain reads as deference, discomfort, and the specific quality of approval-seeking anxiety that genuine social confidence eliminates. Looking to the side when breaking eye contact communicates a categorically different social signal. The lateral break is the gaze signature of someone who is redirecting their attention rather than withdrawing it, who is moving their focus rather than lowering it, and whose relationship to the social encounter is one of engaged authority rather than anxious deference. The sovereign presence protocol eliminates the downward break entirely, replacing it with the consistent practice of lateral and upward breaking patterns that communicate the gaze signature of genuine social confidence regardless of the social context in which the break occurs. The fourth dimension is what the framework calls gaze intensity calibration, the management of the specific quality of attentional engagement that eye contact communicates, along the spectrum from the vacant, unfocused gaze of someone who is physically present but psychologically absent, to the aggressive, unblinking stare that communicates challenge rather than engagement, with the sovereign presence protocol targeting the specific gaze quality that falls between these extremes, the focused, warm, genuinely absorbed quality of someone whose eye contact communicates that the person being looked at is the most interesting thing in their current environment. This gaze quality is not a technique that can be performed without the internal state that generates it. It requires the genuine curiosity orientation that the first impression engineering protocol establishes as the psychological foundation of sovereign presence, because genuine curiosity about another person produces the specific eye quality that communicates authentic
Engagement, while performed interest, produces the subtle inauthenticity signals that perceptive observers detect and that undermine the trust that genuine charismatic eye contact generates. The sovereign eye contact protocol integrates all four dimensions into a coherent, consistently practiced behavioral pattern whose internalization transforms eye contact from an unconscious social habit into a precision instrument of social influence, one that communicates, through every parameter of its execution, the behavioral signature of a professional whose social confidence is genuine, whose engagement is complete, and whose presence in any social encounter constitutes a force that the social brain of every observer is automatically compelled to register, assess, and respond to with the heightened attention and social deference that sovereign eye contact consistently produces. There is a behavior so universally misunderstood in its social significance, so consistently deployed in the opposite direction from its maximum strategic value, and so thoroughly available as a precision instrument of social influence to any professional who understands its actual mechanism, that its consistent underutilization in the charismatic repertoire of otherwise sophisticated professionals must be understood as one of the most consequential missed opportunities in the entire domain of social influence engineering. This behavior is silence, deliberate, calibrated, strategically deployed silence. And the gap between the ordinary professional's relationship to silence, which is one of discomfort to be eliminated as rapidly as possible through the production of whatever verbal content the situation will accept, and the sovereign professional's relationship to it, which is one of strategic resource to be deployed with the same precision and the same intentionality as any other high-value social influence tool, is one of the most revealing indicators of the difference between a professional whose social presence is determined by their anxiety management and a professional whose social presence is determined by their strategic intention. The ordinary professional's relationship to silence is governed by a neurological reality that the charismatic development framework must address directly: the fact that silence in social contexts activates the same threat detection neural circuitry that physical danger activates, producing the specific quality of social discomfort that most professionals experience as the pressure to speak, to fill, to produce verbal content that eliminates the threatening void of social space. This activation is not irrational. It reflects the social reality that silence in ancestral human communities frequently signaled social tension, disapproval, or the withdrawal of social acceptance, whose consequences in a survival-dependent social group were genuinely threatening.
The professional whose nervous system has not been deliberately recalibrated to distinguish between the threat-signaling silence of genuine social rejection and the power-communicating silence of deliberate strategic choice will respond to both with the same filling behavior. The rapid production of verbal content whose primary function is not communication but the elimination of the discomfort that the silence produces in the speaking professional rather than in their audience. This filling behavior is the behavioral signature that most clearly distinguishes the socially anxious professional from the socially sovereign one, not because the content produced to fill silence is necessarily poor, but because the compulsive quality of its production communicates, through the behavioral signal of its urgency, a relationship to social silence that is one of anxiety management rather than strategic choice. The observer's social assessment system reads this urgency accurately and automatically, registering the behavioral signature as someone whose social presence depends on the continuous production of verbal content to maintain its coherence, someone whose silence would reveal an absence rather than a presence. And this reading, delivered automatically and below the threshold of conscious awareness, adjusts the observer's assessment of the filling professional's social status and confidence downward in correspondence with the anxiety that the filling behavior communicates. The sovereign professional's relationship to silence is built on a fundamental reframe of what silence communicates in social contexts, a reframe from silence as absence to silence as presence. The deliberate silence of a socially confident professional is not an empty space waiting to be filled. It is a full space occupied by a quality of attention, engagement, and self-possessed ease, whose communication through behavioral channels produces a specific and powerful social effect. When the sovereign professional pauses before responding to a question, that pause communicates that their response is worth waiting for, that the quality of thought being brought to the question warrants the temporal investment that the pause requires. When the sovereign professional allows a moment of silence to follow an important statement, that silence communicates that the statement has weight, that it deserves the reflective space that the silence provides, rather than the immediate continuation that would dilute it. When the sovereign professional maintains silence in a situation where the social pressure to speak is intense, that silence communicates a relationship to social pressure that is one of sovereign indifference rather than anxious compliance. The strategic deployment of silence in professional contexts operates through four primary mechanisms whose understanding transforms silence from a passive
absence of speech into an active social influence tool of considerable power. The first mechanism is the response pause, the deliberate insertion of a 2 to 4 second pause between the completion of another person's statement and the beginning of one's own response. The response pause communicates through the behavioral signal of its unhurried quality that the speaker is genuinely processing what has been said, rather than merely waiting for their turn to speak. A communication that produces in the other person the specific experience of feeling genuinely heard that is one of the most powerful generators of interpersonal trust and social affiliation available in the charismatic repertoire. Simultaneously, the response pause communicates the specific quality of thoughtful deliberation that elevates the perceived quality of whatever follows it. The statement preceded by a deliberate pause is automatically perceived as more considered, more valuable, and more worthy of attention than the identical statement produced without it. The second mechanism is the wait pause, the deliberate insertion of silence immediately following a significant statement, claim, or assertion, allowing the statement to occupy the social space without competition from subsequent verbal content that would dilute its impact. The wait pause is the behavioral equivalent of underlining. It signals to the observer's social processing system that the statement just made warrants the specific quality of attention that silence invites, and it communicates through its confident deployment that the speaker is sufficiently certain of the statement's quality to allow it to stand alone without the defensive elaboration that social anxiety habitually adds.
The third mechanism is the pressure silence, the deliberate maintenance of silence in response to social pressure to speak, used most powerfully in negotiation and high-stakes interpersonal contexts, where the first person to fill a silence typically concedes strategic ground to the person who maintains it. The pressure silence is the most demanding of the four mechanisms because it requires the most direct confrontation with the threat activation that social silence produces. But it is also the most strategically powerful because the professional who can maintain genuine, unperturbed silence under social pressure communicates through that maintenance a relationship to social discomfort that is the clearest available behavioral signal of authentic social sovereignty. The fourth mechanism is the contemplative silence, the deliberate use of silence not as a response to another person's communication, but as an expression of one's own internal engagement with a question, problem, or situation, deployed visibly and without apology as a communication of genuine intellectual depth and the specific quality of unhurried thinking that social confidence makes possible.
There is a dimension of charismatic presence that the behavioral frameworks focused exclusively on specific skills and techniques consistently fail to address with sufficient depth. A dimension that is not a skill in the conventional sense, but a foundational resource whose availability determines whether every skill in the charismatic repertoire can be deployed with the quality and consistency that genuine social magnetism requires, or whether those skills degrade progressively under the conditions of sustained social engagement, until the professional's charismatic presence has been reduced to a performance whose inauthenticity is increasingly detectable by the social assessment systems of everyone they encounter. This dimension is social energy, the specific quality of psychological and physiological vitality that genuine charismatic presence requires as its operational fuel, and whose management is as consequential for the sustained effectiveness of the charismatic professional as the management of any other finite, depletable, and strategically critical resource in the professional's operational toolkit. The professional who has developed extraordinary behavioral skills in every dimension of charismatic presence, but who has not developed the energy management architecture that sustains those skills under conditions of sustained social demand, will find their charismatic effectiveness degrading predictably and systematically across the duration of any extended professional engagement, producing the specific pattern of increasingly effortful social performance, progressively reduced presence quality, and eventual behavioral authenticity collapse that social energy depletion reliably generates in professionals who have not built the management systems that prevent it. The foundational insight of social energy architecture is the recognition that social environments do not have a uniform relationship to the psychological and physiological resources that charismatic presence requires, that different social environments, different social interactions, and different social roles make categorically different demands on those resources, and that the charismatic professional's capacity to navigate a complex, sustained professional social environment with consistent presence quality depends critically on their ability to map those differential demands accurately and to manage their resource allocation across the full environmental landscape in ways that prevent the depletion that degrades performance before the most consequential social encounters of the professional day have occurred. The professional who enters their most important meeting of the day already depleted by the energy demands of less consequential social engagements that preceded it is not merely performing at a reduced level, they are performing from a psychological and physiological state whose behavioral signatures communicate through every nonverbal channel simultaneously. Specific quality of effortful management that genuine social sovereignty eliminates. And that communication is registered by every person in the room whose social assessment system is sensitive enough to detect the difference between authentic, charismatic presence and its depleted simulation. The social energy mapping that effective architecture requires begins with the explicit categorization of the professional's social environment into what the framework identifies as three distinct energy relationship categories. The first category is energy-generative social contexts, interactions and environments that leave the professional in a higher state of psychological and physiological vitality than they entered, characterized by the specific quality of genuine engagement, authentic connection, and values-aligned social exchange that produces the neurochemical conditions of positive social experience, rather than the neurochemical conditions of social threat management. The second category is energy-neutral social contexts, interactions and environments whose demands approximately match the resources they generate, producing neither the vitality increase of genuinely generative contexts nor the depletion of genuinely draining ones. The third category is energy extractive social contexts, interactions and environments that systematically draw down the professional's psychological and physiological resources without providing equivalent regenerative value, characterized by the specific demands of sustained performance management, values misaligned social exchange, and the specific quality of social inauthenticity that requires the continuous deployment of self-monitoring and behavioral management resources that authentic presence does not. The strategic management of these three categories is not the elimination of energy extractive contexts from the professional's social environment. That elimination is neither possible nor desirable in most professional contexts, where the most consequential social engagements frequently occur in environments whose energy demands are highest precisely because their stakes are highest. It is the deliberate sequencing, spacing, and preparation management of energy extractive contexts in ways that ensure the professional's resource levels at the beginning of each high-demand social engagement are sufficient to sustain the full quality of charismatic presence that the engagement requires throughout its complete duration. This sequencing is the primary operational expression of social energy architecture, the deliberate construction of a professional's social schedule whose energy demand distribution is managed with the same strategic intentionality that financial resource allocation or time management receives in the most sophisticated professional planning frameworks. The regenerative practices that sustain the resource levels that social energy architecture requires fall into three categories, whose integration produces a comprehensive energy management system. The first category is pre-engagement. Regeneration, the specific practices deployed in the period immediately preceding a high-demand social engagement to restore the resource levels that preceding engagements may have drawn down. These practices are not generic relaxation techniques. They are precisely calibrated interventions targeting the specific psychological and physiological resource dimensions that the upcoming engagement will most heavily draw upon, whose selection is therefore dependent on the specific nature of the upcoming engagement's demands and on the specific dimensions in which the professional's current resource levels are most depleted relative to the optimal baseline that full charismatic presence requires. The second category is in-engagement conservation, the specific behavioral practices that reduce the rate of resource consumption during high-demand social engagements without reducing the quality of charismatic presence that those engagements require. The most consequential in-engagement conservation practice is what the framework calls authentic presence substitution, the deliberate replacement of performed social behaviors whose execution requires the continuous deployment of self-monitoring and behavioral management resources, with authentic behavioral expressions whose execution draws on the resources of genuine psychological engagement rather than on the resources of performance management.
Every behavior in the charismatic repertoire that has been sufficiently internalized to operate from genuine psychological states rather than from deliberate behavioral execution is a behavior that has been converted from a performance-consuming pursuit into a resource-neutral or resource-generative expression. And the progressive internalization of the charismatic behavioral repertoire is therefore simultaneously a progressive reduction in the energy cost of its deployment. The third category is post-engagement restoration, the specific practices that accelerate the recovery of depleted resources following high-demand social engagements, restoring the professional's resource levels toward the optimal baseline that the next high-demand engagement will require, with the maximum efficiency that deliberate restoration practice can achieve relative to the passive recovery that the absence of deliberate practice produces. There is a quality of verbal communication that separates the professional whose statements are processed, acknowledged, and forgotten from the professional whose statements are processed, retained, and referenced, a quality that is not primarily a function of the content's inherent importance, the speaker's positional authority,
or the sophistication of the argument being made, but of the specific architectural properties of the language through which that content is delivered. This quality is linguistic magnetism, the specific combination of structural, rhythmic, imagistic, and semantic properties that makes a statement adhere to the listener's memory with a force that the same content delivered in ordinary language does not produce, that makes the speaker's communication feel qualitatively different from the information exchange that constitutes the majority of professional verbal interaction, and that generates in the listener the specific neurological experience of encountering language that is doing something more than transmitting propositions, language that is creating an experience, shaping a perception, and constructing a reality in the listener's mind that persists long after the specific words that created it have faded from conscious recall. Linguistic magnetism is not eloquence in the literary sense. It is not the production of beautiful language for its own sake, and its development does not require the literary sensibility or the aesthetic orientation that eloquence in the conventional sense implies. It is a precise engineering discipline whose principles can be learned, whose techniques can be practiced, and whose outputs can be calibrated with sufficient accuracy to transform any professional's verbal communication from a functional information delivery system into a social influence instrument of genuine power. The first architectural principle of linguistic magnetism is specificity over generality, the deliberate replacement of abstract, general, category-level language with concrete, specific, sensory-level language, whose processing by the listener's brain activates the same neural systems that direct sensory experience activates, producing a quality of mental engagement that abstract language cannot generate. The statement that leadership requires courage is processed by the listener's brain as an abstract proposition. It activates the language processing systems, produces a semantic representation of the proposition's content, and is stored in the memory system as a verbal formulation whose retrieval requires the same deliberate, effortful recall that any other verbally stored proposition requires. The statement that the leader who speaks the truth in the room where everyone has already agreed to be comfortable is the leader whose words people remember when the crisis arrives is processed by the listener's brain through a fundamentally different mechanism. The specific social scenario it describes activates the brain's social simulation systems, producing a vivid, experiential mental representation whose storage and retrieval draws on the episodic memory systems that concrete, scenario-based content engages, rather than the semantic memory systems that abstract propositions engage. Episodic memories are retrieved more readily, more completely, and with greater emotional vividness than semantic memories, which means that the specific scenario-grounded statement is not merely more engaging to hear than the abstract generality. Abstract 1. It is more permanently stored, more readily retrieved, and more likely to be referenced, repeated, and attributed to its speaker in subsequent contexts. The second architectural principle is tension before resolution, the deliberate construction of statements that create a specific quality of cognitive or emotional tension in the first half of the statement that the second half resolves, producing the neurological experience of micro-narrative completion that the brain finds intensely satisfying and that makes the complete statement significantly more memorable than either its tension-creating or resolution-providing half would be in isolation. The brain is a narrative processing machine whose most fundamental cognitive operation is the construction and completion of meaningful sequences. It is deeply satisfied by the experience of a tension resolution arc, regardless of whether that arc spans the 2 hours of a feature film or the 2 seconds of a well-constructed sentence, and it stores the statement that provides this satisfaction with the specific vividness and retrievability that satisfaction-associated memories receive. The professional who constructs their most important statements with deliberate attention to the tension resolution architecture is not merely making their communication more engaging, they are leveraging one of the brain's most fundamental processing preferences to make their words more permanently and more vividly stored in the listener's memory than the same content delivered without that architecture would be. The third architectural principle is the concrete image over the abstract concept, the deliberate use of specific, visually graspable images as the primary vehicles for communicating ideas whose direct abstract statement would be accurate but unmemorable. The concrete image activates the visual processing systems of the brain in ways that abstract language cannot, producing a mental representation whose vividness, specificity, and sensory richness makes it significantly more durable in memory than the abstract proposition that the image is communicating. The most memorable statements in the history of political, philosophical, and literary communication are not memorable because their content is more profound than the content of the forgettable statements that surround them in the same texts. They're memorable because their content has been encoded in concrete images, whose visual specificity gives the brain's memory systems something to hold that the memory systems cannot hold when given only abstract propositions. The fourth architectural principle is rhythm and cadence management, the deliberate attention to the sonic and rhythmic properties of statements whose content warrants maximum memorability, using the brain's strong preference for rhythmically organized sound sequences to enhance the storage and retrieval of the statements that exhibit those properties. This principle does not require the professional to speak in verse or to sacrifice natural conversational flow for the of rhythmic regularity. It requires only the awareness that the sonic properties of a statement are not merely aesthetic features of its delivery, but functional properties that affect its neurological processing and its memorial durability, and the corresponding practice of attending to those properties in the construction of the statements that most warrant retention. The fifth architectural principle is the unexpected connection, the deliberate juxtaposition of two concepts, domains, or images that the listener's prior experience has not associated with each other, producing the specific neurological experience of insight that novel conceptual connections generate, and that makes the statement producing that experience significantly more memorable and more attributed to its speaker than statements whose conceptual content confirms rather than extends the listener's existing associative networks. Part 8. Social Polarity: Why Genuine Magnetism Requires the Courage to Repel. There is a strategic error so deeply embedded in the social behavior of ambitious professionals that its correction produces an immediate and visceral resistance whose intensity is directly proportional to the degree of social approval seeking that the professional's developmental history has produced, an error that is not merely ineffective as a social influence strategy, but that is actively self-defeating in its mechanism, producing the precise opposite of the social outcome
outcome it is designed to achieve with a reliability and a consistency that the social psychology literature has documented across every population and every social context, studied with sufficient rigor to produce generalizable conclusions. This error is the strategy of universal approval seeking, the systematic attempt to present a version of oneself to every social audience that has been carefully calibrated to generate positive responses from every member of that audience simultaneously, eliminating from the professional's social presentation any element that might generate friction, disagreement, or the specific quality of social discomfort that genuine differences of values, perspective, or character inevitably produces in any sufficiently diverse social environment. This strategy does not produce universal approval, it produces universal indifference, the specific social response that a social presence generates when it has made itself sufficiently nonspecific, sufficiently accommodating, and sufficiently stripped of the genuine particularity that makes a person interesting.
Memorable and worth engaging with at any level deeper than the pleasant but ultimately forgettable surface of agreeable professional interaction. The mechanism through which universal approval seeking produces universal indifference is rooted in a fundamental property of human social attraction that the approval seeking strategies practitioners consistently fail to understand. The property that genuine social attraction is not generated by the absence of friction, but by the presence of polarity. Social polarity is the condition that exists when a person's genuine character, values, perspective, and behavioral signature is sufficiently specific, sufficiently well-defined, and sufficiently authentically expressed that it creates a strong positive response in people whose own character, values, and perspective are aligned with it, and a corresponding negative response in people whose character, values, and perspective are not. This polarity is not a design flaw in the charismatic professional social strategy. It is the foundational mechanism through which genuine social magnetism operates, because the strength of the positive attraction that polarity generates is inseparable from the strength of the negative repulsion it simultaneously produces. A social presence that generates strong positive attraction in some people and neutral responses in everyone else is not a magnetic social presence. It is a pleasant one. A social presence that generates strong positive attraction in some people and strong negative responses in others is a magnetic one, because the strength of the response in both directions is evidence of the genuine particularity, the authentic self-definition, and the social courage that genuine charisma requires and that the universal approval-seeking strategy systematically eliminates. The social psychology of polarity is rooted in what researchers in interpersonal attraction have identified as the distinctiveness effect, the empirically robust finding that people who are perceived as distinct, specific, and clearly defined in their character and values are consistently rated as more attractive, more interesting, and more memorable than people who are perceived as agreeable, accommodating, and difficult to characterize with specificity. Distinctiveness is attractive not because humans prefer difficulty over ease or conflict over harmony. It is attractive because distinctiveness is the behavioral signal of genuine self-possession, and genuine self-possession is the social marker of a person whose approval, when given, actually means something, because it is not given to everyone. The approval of a person who approves of everyone costs nothing to obtain and means nothing when obtained. The social brain registers this automatically and discounts the value of that person's social validation accordingly. The approval of a person who clearly does not approve of everyone, who has visible standards, genuine preferences, and the specific quality of selective social engagement that self-possessed distinctiveness produces, is a social currency of genuine value, because the social brain registers its selectivity values the approval that this selectivity makes meaningful in proportion to the exclusivity that the person's standards create. The construction of deliberate social polarity in the professional's social presentation is not the performance of conflict or the adoption of deliberately contrarian positions for their own social effect.
It is the authentic, undefended expression of the professional's genuine character, values, and perspective in social contexts where the approval-seeking impulse and its behavioral expressions have become so habitual that their replacement with authentic expression requires deliberate, sustained, and initially uncomfortable practice. Values clarity is the foundation of polarity because you cannot generate genuine social polarity without having a genuinely specific, genuinely well-defined set of values, perspectives, and character qualities to polarize around. And the professional whose values clarity is insufficient to generate consistent social polarity is the professional whose social presence has been so thoroughly shaped by the approval-seeking strategy that genuine self-definition has been progressively replaced by the socially constructed amalgam of agreeable qualities that universal approval-seeking produces. The social courage that polarity requires is not the courage of confrontation. It is the courage of authentic self-expression in social contexts where that expression creates friction, generates disagreement, and produces in some observers exactly the negative response that polarity predicts and that the approval-seeking impulse is designed to prevent. This courage is developed not through a single dramatic act of social authenticity, but through the consistent practice of small, deliberate
Selectivity and values the approval that this selectivity makes meaningful in proportion to the exclusivity that the person's standards create. The construction of deliberate social polarity in the professional's social presentation is not the performance of conflict or the adoption of deliberately contrarian positions for their own social effect. It is the authentic, undefended expression of the professional's genuine character, values, and perspective in social contexts where the approval-seeking impulse habitually produces the self-editing, position-softening, and perspective-modulating behaviors that eliminate the distinctiveness that genuine polarity requires. The professional who expresses their genuine assessment of a situation in a room where that assessment differs from the consensus view, not aggressively, not defensively, but with the calm, grounded quality of someone who is simply stating what they actually think, is generating social polarity through the authentic expression of genuine distinctiveness. The professional who declines to perform enthusiasm they do not feel, agreement they do not hold, or interest they do not experience, not rudely, but with the honest disengagement of someone whose social responses are determined by genuine internal states rather than by the performance of whatever response the social situation seems to request, is generating social polarity through the authentic expression of genuine standards. The cultivation of social polarity requires the systematic development of what the framework calls values clarity, the explicit, precisely articulated knowledge of what one actually values, what one actually believes, and what one actually finds interesting, important, and worth engaging with, combined with the social courage to express that clarity consistently in professional social contexts where the approval-seeking impulse and its behavioral expressions have become so habitual that their replacement with authentic expression requires deliberate, sustained, and initially uncomfortable practice. Values clarity is the foundation of polarity, because you cannot generate genuine social polarity without having a genuinely specific, genuinely well-defined set of values, perspectives, and character qualities to polarize around. And the professional whose values clarity is insufficient to generate consistent social polarity is the professional whose social presence has been so thoroughly shaped by the approval-seeking strategy that genuine self-definition has been progressively replaced by the socially constructed amalgam of agreeable qualities that universal approval-seeking produces.
The social courage that polarity requires is not the courage of confrontation. It is the courage of authentic self-expression in social contexts where that expression creates friction, generates disagreement, and produces in some observers exactly the negative response that polarity predicts, and that the approval-seeking impulse is designed to prevent. This courage is developed not through a single dramatic act of social authenticity, but through the consistent practice of small, deliberate
expressions of genuine perspective in low-stakes social contexts, building the psychological tolerance for the social friction that authentic distinctiveness produces, until that tolerance is sufficient to sustain genuine self-expression in the high-stakes contexts where the approval-seeking impulse is strongest and where the social magnetism that polarity generates is most consequential. There is a capability that the most socially magnetic professionals in every domain possesses that produces a social effect so powerful, so consistently documented in the interpersonal psychology literature, and so disproportionately rare in professional environments whose interaction culture is dominated by the transactional, agenda-driven, time-compressed social exchanges that high-performance organizational life generates, that its deliberate development constitutes one of the highest leverage investments available in the entire charismatic skill repertoire. This capability is not a communication technique in the conventional sense. It is not a specific behavioral pattern that can be executed through the conscious deployment of a memorized protocol. It is a quality of interpersonal engagement whose behavioral expressions are the authentic outputs of a specific internal orientation towards other people. An orientation that, when genuinely present and genuinely communicated through the full range of behavioral channels that social perception monitors, produces in the recipient the specific experience of feeling genuinely seen, genuinely valued, and genuinely significant in the eyes of the person engaging with them. This experience is among the most powerful social experiences that human beings can provide for each other, and the professional who provides it consistently and authentically, not as a performance deployed strategically for social influence purposes, but as the genuine expression of an actually developed capacity for the quality of interpersonal engagement that produces it, builds around themselves a social network of genuine loyalty, genuine advocacy, and genuine relational investment that operates in their favor with a consistency and a depth that no transactional social strategy can replicate or replace. The internal orientation that this capability requires is what the framework calls genuine other focus, a quality of interpersonal engagement in which the professional's attention during any social interaction is genuinely, completely, and unhurriedly directed towards the other person's experience, perspective, and significance, rather than toward the management of their own social impression, the execution of their own social agenda, or the monitoring of their own performance quality. Genuine other focus is not selflessness in the philosophical sense. It does not require the elimination of the professional's own interests, perspectives, or social objectives from their interpersonal engagement. It requires the specific capacity to temporarily and completely subordinate those interests, perspectives, and objectives to the genuine engagement with another person's experience that makes that person feel genuinely significant, and then to re-engage with one's own interests, perspectives, and objectives from the enriched platform that the genuine relational connection that other focus produces has created. This capacity is both rarer and more developable than its apparent simplicity suggests. Rarer because the default orientation of most professional social interaction is self-focused rather than other-focused, driven by the approval-seeking, impression-managing, and agenda-executing orientations that professional socialization produces. The first practice is what the framework calls complete attentional transfer, the deliberate, physically expressed shift of the professional's complete attentional resources from whatever occupied them before the social interaction began to the specific person with whom the interaction is now occurring.
Complete attentional transfer is communicated through the same behavioral channels that sovereign presence deploys: postural orientation, eye contact quality, the elimination of competing attentional stimuli, and the specific quality of facial responsiveness that genuine attentional engagement produces, and that performed attentional engagement cannot replicate with sufficient accuracy to deceive the social assessment systems of perceptive observers. The professional who executes complete attentional transfer in every social interaction, who communicates through every available behavioral channel that the person they are currently engaging with is the complete and undivided focus of their attention, is providing that person with an experience that is so rare in the distracted, multitasking, agenda-saturated social environment of most professional contexts that its provision alone generates a powerful and lasting positive impression whose social effects compound across every subsequent interaction in the relationship. The second practice is what the framework calls deep question architecture, the deliberate construction of questions that communicate genuine interest in the other person's experience, perspective, and inner world, rather than the surface-level information gathering that conventional professional social conversation produces. The difference between a conventional professional question and a deep question is not primarily a matter of topic depth. It is a matter of the orientation that the question communicates. A conventional professional question asks for information. It treats the other person as a source of data about their professional domain, organizational context, or situational specifics. A deep question asks for perspective. It treats the other person as a source of genuinely interesting subjective experience. Experience whose specific quality the questioner is genuinely curious about. The professional whose social questions consistently demonstrate genuine curiosity about other people's actual experience, perspective, and inner world, rather than about the professional information that most social questioning treats as the primary currency of interpersonal exchange, communicates through the quality of their questioning a quality of genuine interest in the other person's humanity that is both extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily powerful in its social effects. The third practice is social memory cultivation, the deliberate encoding and retrieval of specific, personally significant details from previous interactions with each person in the professional's social network, deployed in subsequent interactions as evidence of the genuine attentional investment that their relationship represents. The professional who remembers and who demonstrates that they remember specific details of previous conversations, specific challenges that a person mentioned facing, specific aspirations that a person expressed, or specific personal details that a person shared, communicates through the specificity of that memory a quality of genuine relational investment that the generic social pleasantries of most professional relationship maintenance cannot match. This memory is not merely a social courtesy, it is a powerful social signal whose communication produces in the recipient the specific experience of being genuinely held in the mind and the attention of a person whose social significance makes that holding feel valuable. The social network that this experience builds, the network of people who feel genuinely known, genuinely valued, and genuinely connected to the professional whose social memory has made them feel significant, is the most durable, most loyal, and most actively supportive social asset that any charismatic strategy can generate, because it is built not on transactional exchange, but on the genuine relational experience that only authentic other focus can produce. The architecture of social memory is completed by what the framework calls the significance loop, the deliberate practice of communicating to each person in the professional's social network at appropriate intervals and through appropriate channels the specific ways in which their perspective, their contribution, or their presence has been genuinely valuable to the professional's own thinking, development, or professional experience. The significance loop closes the relational circuit that genuine other focus opens, transforming the experience of feeling genuinely attended to into the experience of being genuinely valued, and producing in the recipient the specific quality of relational loyalty that genuine mutual significance generates.
The eye contact protocol in negotiation contexts requires specific calibration beyond the general sovereign eye contact framework established in the fourth section, calibration that accounts for the specific social dynamics of the negotiation encounter, in which eye contact functions not merely as a presence signal, but as a real-time power communication whose parameters at each moment of the exchange communicate specific information about the negotiator's confidence in their current position, their comfort with the current dynamic, and their relationship to the social pressure that the counterpart's tactical moves are designed to generate. The negotiation-specific eye contact protocol maintains the sovereign gaze during the communication of the negotiator's own positions and proposals, the moments of greatest vulnerability to the eye-breaking behaviors that social anxiety produces, and deploys the deliberate, calm attentional engagement of genuine listening during the counterpart's communications, communicating through the quality of that attention the specific message that the negotiator is genuinely processing what is being said, rather than merely waiting for an opportunity to respond. Strategic silence in negotiation contexts is where its power is most dramatically demonstrated and most consequentially deployed, because the negotiation is the professional context in which the social pressure to fill silence is highest, in which the first person to fill a silence most consistently concedes strategic ground to the person who maintains it, and in which the capacity to sit with genuine comfort in the specific quality of charged expectant silence that follows a significant offer, counteroffer, or positional statement is the clearest available demonstration of the psychological self-possession that sovereign presence requires. The negotiator who can make a proposal and then wait, genuinely, comfortably, without the fidgeting, qualifying, or elaborating behaviors that silence anxiety produces, is communicating through that silence the specific message that their proposal stands on its own merits and requires no defensive elaboration, that they are comfortable with whatever response the silence eventually produces, and that their psychological security in the negotiation is sufficiently complete that the discomfort of silence represents no threat to their composure or their strategic clarity. This communication is registered automatically by the counterpart's social assessment system and produces a corresponding adjustment in their perception of the silent negotiator's confidence and authority that influences the quality of the response that the silence eventually elicits. The linguistic magnetism framework contributes to negotiation performance through the specific application of its principles to the verbal architecture of proposals, positions, and responses, the construction of offers that are communicated with the specific combination of specificity, tension resolution architecture, and concrete imagery that makes them feel more considered, more substantial, and more psychologically compelling than the same substantive content delivered in ordinary transactional language. The negotiator whose proposals are linguistically magnetic is not merely communicating the terms of an offer, they are constructing an experience of those terms in the counterpart's mind that is more vivid, more complete, and more emotionally resonant than the abstract numerical and conditional formulations that conventional negotiation language produces. Social polarity in negotiation manifests as the specific quality of principled firmness that charismatic negotiators communicate, the clear, grounded, undefended expression of genuine positions and genuine values whose behavioral signature communicates authentic conviction rather than tactical posturing. The negotiator who expresses their positions with the calm specificity of someone who actually holds those positions, rather than with the hedged, qualified, approval-seeking tentativeness of someone who is testing the social acceptability of the position before fully committing to it, generates a specific social response in their counterpart.
the response of genuine engagement with a genuine position, rather than the tactical probing that tentative positioning invites. And the social memory practices that build genuine relational connection contribute to negotiation outcomes through the specific mechanism of trust generation, the creation of the interpersonal trust that makes counterparts more willing to move from their stated positions toward creative solutions that serve both parties' genuine interests rather than the defended positions that low-trust negotiation dynamics consistently produce. The integration of all charismatic framework components in negotiation produces a negotiator who is not merely more tactically sophisticated than their counterpart. They are operating from a social influence platform whose depth, consistency, and genuine psychological foundation gives every tactical move they make a social resonance that the same move, made from an ordinary social presence, would not generate. There is a distinction at the heart of organizational leadership that separates the leaders whose organizational impact is limited to the direct outputs of their positional authority that their organizational role provides, from the leaders whose organizational impact extends into the discretionary effort, genuine commitment, and voluntary alignment of every person within their sphere of influence, a distinction that is not primarily a function of strategic vision, technical expertise, or even the quality of the decisions that the leader makes, but of the specific quality of social presence that the leader brings to every organizational interaction through which their leadership is actually experienced by the people it is supposed to inspire.
This distinction is the difference between positional leadership and charismatic leadership, and the organizations whose leaders have developed the charismatic presence that the distinction requires are not merely better led in some intangible qualitative sense, they are measurably more effective in every dimension of organizational performance that depends on the discretionary effort of human beings whose motivation is determined by their genuine relationship to the leader they are following, rather than by their contractual obligation to the organizational role that leader occupies. Positional leadership operates through the authority structure that organizational hierarchy provides, the formal power to direct, evaluate, reward, and sanction that the leader's positional role grants them, and that produces compliance from the organizational members subject to it through the straightforward mechanism of incentive alignment and consequence management. Positional leadership is not without value. It produces the baseline behavioral alignment that organizational functioning requires, but it produces only that baseline, and the ceiling of organizational performance that baseline compliance generates is significantly lower than the ceiling that genuine voluntary commitment produces in organizational systems where the leader's charismatic presence has motivated people to invest their discretionary effort, their creative problem-solving capacity, and their genuine personal engagement in outcomes that they have come to genuinely care about rather than merely to comply with. Charismatic leadership produces voluntary commitment through a mechanism that is fundamentally different from the incentive and consequence management that positional leadership deploys. The mechanism of genuine identification with the leader's vision, values, and presence. Organizational members who genuinely identify with their leader do not merely comply with their directives, they internalize their objectives, extend their behavioral alignment beyond the explicit requirements of their role, and invest the specific quality of discretionary effort and creative engagement that positional compliance cannot produce, because it is, by definition, not required by the positional authority structure that compliance responds to. This identification is not produced by the quality of the leader's strategic vision, however compelling, or by the sophistication of their organizational design, however effective. It is produced by the specific quality of interpersonal experience that the leader's charismatic presence creates in every direct interaction between the leader and the organizational members whose identification is the organizational asset that charismatic leadership generates. The charismatic leader's organizational presence operates through every dimension of the framework that the preceding sections have established, deployed with the specific calibrations that the organizational leadership context requires.